everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. I have a different setup going on at the moment. I am currently, and I am not exaggerating at all here, I am currently in the corner of my bedroom. Everything, including me, is sat on the floor. My microphone is balanced on my knee. The reason for this is where I was recording in the spare room, which I was using as a little podcast studio, has now been turned into a bedroom for dear daughter 2, which is wonderful. Don't get me wrong, she's very happy with it. And we had a great weekend as a family designing it, putting it all together. But it means that the podcasting studio, and I'm very much saying that in inverted commas, is now a corner of my bedroom and my husband's bedroom, whilst we now figure out how we are going to make that go forward. But actually, I've already been testing out the sound on GarageBand. I'm now recording in Descript, and I'll come on to that in a little bit. But I was recording in GarageBand just to play around with it. And actually, I feel that the audio is actually a little bit better because it's carpeted in here. I'm talking into like a bit more of a corner. So I feel like the audio is a bit better. I'd be interested to know what you all think. As I said, I'm recording in Descript at the moment. I have forever been recording in Riverside. You all know that I'm a huge advocate for Riverside, but I just found that, I don't know, I just feel like it's been kind of glitchy over the last few months or so. So I don't know, it could just be me, but I decided that I was going to take the opportunity, cancelled my subscription. This isn't hating on them. I was just finding that, I don't know, maybe it's my bandwidth. I don't know. Could be anything. But I've cancelled my subscription to Riverside, and I'm now taking the opportunity to try out a few different things. So I was playing around with GarageBand, but then I decided, actually, I have a free account on Descript. Why don't I trip over to Descript again? I used it at the beginning of the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting, so I'm going to try it again. So here we are. But we're not talking about any of that for this episode. What we're talking about for this particular episode is, are you killing your podcast growth? And you're probably thinking, no, I'm doing absolutely everything I can to make my podcast grow at an amazing rate. Just no, Verity, what are you chatting about? But I think you could possibly be killing your podcast's own growth without even realizing that. And I'm going to explain that to you, and then stick around until the end of the show, where I'm actually going to give you 3 top tips that you can implement today to make sure that you are actually growing your podcast at a rate that you want to be seeing results from, and getting your podcast to whatever that point is that you define as your podcast being successful. So do stick around for those top tips for how to grow your podcast at the end of the show. Let's unpick this. Are you killing your podcast growth? And it's that idea, I feel, of podcasters just being scared to make changes. You know, we start with a certain status quo, you know, we stick with the same software, the same tech, the same marketing, whatever it is. We have systems and processes in place, and that's great. But I think it's really important to realize people are creatures of habit, and therefore by default podcasters are creatures of habit. And I think that there's this massive conversation to be had around people being scared to change things, because we don't like major changes. So why would we want major changes in our podcasting? And, you know, changes could be anything. It could be, like I've said, how I have decided to stop using Riverside temporarily. Might be permanent, we shall see. And I'm experimenting with Descript, or I might even go back to GarageBand. That's a change that some people might think, well, I'm not going to do that. But actually, through one way or another, it might improve my podcast growth. It could be that you find that you have this little bug at the back of your mind that you need to change your podcast name, or even just tweak your podcast name slightly. Maybe you want to insert some more keywords, or any keywords at all that people are searching for to find your podcast, into your show name. But you're scared to do that because, well, what if I rebrand and I lose all of those listeners? Yes, but what if you rebrand and you gain loads of visitors as well? And, you know, that was exactly my experience with my first podcast. It was originally called Bloggers Creating Courses. I was really, really worried when I changed it to The Confident CEO that I was just going to lose all those listeners. But actually what I did was I saw exponential growth with that change, with that name change, because it was much more specific. I was using keywords that people were searching for, and I carried those through to my show notes, through to my episode descriptions, through to the podcast description as well. And I think that's another key point as well, is looking at your show notes. Are you somebody who's maybe just used a couple of lines before, and actually you could be writing show notes that are much more in depth? And if you're thinking, Verity, I don't have the time to do that, you could use a free tool such as ChatGPT. You could use paid for systems such as Summarize or Capsho, and those tools will really help to flesh out your show notes and get those keywords in there. And it could be that you change the format of your episodes slightly. That again could be huge. So I had so many people when I got rid of the introduction for Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting being like, oh, what are you doing? But everyone says you need a podcast intro and all these kind of things. And I just think, you know what, if you want a podcast intro, like, you know, a formalized one with music and stuff, fine. And I'm not saying I'll never go back to that. But what I am saying is that it seemed like a scary change to implement and not have a kind of, you know, traditional quote unquote intro for my show. But actually I found that it's been really, really great at retention for the podcast, and it's given people the opportunity to message me in DM, particularly on Twitter, and say things like, oh, it's actually given me the confidence to do this myself. So what I mean when I say, are you killing your podcast growth? I think a lot of it is podcasters kill their podcast growth by sticking with the status quo and sticking with strategies that just aren't working. And I think sometimes we need to be really critical with ourselves and look at our show. And if we're not growing in the way that we want, and that growth, by the way, can look so many different ways. It could be growth in terms of download growth. It could be growth in terms of audience retention. So having your audience listen to your episodes for longer. That growth is going to look different for every single podcaster. And we need to be out of the mindset that growth always equates to more downloads. But I do honestly think that a lot of people get in the way of their own podcast's growth because they're not willing to try new things. So that then brings me on to these 3 tips, which I promised you that I would give you about how to grow your podcast. And you can implement these today. So the first thing is to tell everybody about your podcast. The number one way of getting new listeners and new ears on your podcast is to tell people about it. Word of mouth referral is the top way for people to discover podcasts. So tell people about your podcast. And if you want more information about that, click the link in the show notes where I've got a 5-day email challenge, which focuses on those easy wins, those easy strategies to help you grow your podcast. Make sure you signed up to that. The second way to grow your podcast is play around with different keywords in your podcast title and in your podcast show description. Really consider not what you think your audience are searching for in the keywords, but talk to your audience and find out what kind of keywords are they typing into Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc., and utilize that knowledge and utilize those keywords, because that is going to help you rank in search results. And finally, experiment with different podcast categories for your podcast to be listed in. So if you're in an education category for your podcast, that's not really working too well for you. Well, maybe switch it up a little bit. And are you better suited in business? Or equally, if you've got a podcast in the business category but you're finding it's not ranking too well and your goal is to get in the charts, well, actually, have you got a tech-based business podcast and you could put yourself in the technology category? You might find it doesn't work and you want to put yourself back in the business category again, but experiment with these things. Try yourself out in different categories and see if that helps with your podcast growth. Consider to yourself, when my audience is searching for a podcast like mine, which categories are they going to? It's not the categories you think they're going to or you want to rank in. It's thinking about where people are going in Apple Podcasts, in Spotify, which charts, which categories are they clicking through and scrolling through to find shows like yours. So those are my top 3 tips. Tell everyone about your podcast, play around with different keywords, and experiment with your podcast in different categories. Do you think that you're actually guilty of killing your podcast's growth? Jump on over to Twitter, send me a DM. And if you have got a podcast friend who you think could benefit from this episode. I would love it if you could share the link with them and see how these strategies can also help them. Otherwise, thank you so much for spending another episode with me, and I will see you next time.